Hello, so good afternoon everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody to the chamber today for the Children and Young People's Overview and Scrutiny panel. So just a bit of housekeeping first of all. So if a fire practice is not expected, but if the alarm sounds, can all present leave the building as quickly as possible by way of the nearest exit to the assembly point in the public square outside Cast, beyond the fountain and away from the civic office. No roll call can be undertaken. Thank you. If anyone has mobility issues, please wait in the refuge area at the top of the stairs where the emergency evacuation lift is located, and use the intercom situated to the left-hand side of the lift doors to call for assistance. I would also like to ask everyone to ensure that their mobile phones are switched to silent mode, please. This meeting will be audio and visually recorded and will be available to view on the Council's website and YouTube channel. Can I ask all those present to use their microphones to ensure that audio can be captured? Any members of the public entering the Council chamber are accepting that their images will be retained and broadcast by the Council. I understand that there are no members of the public in attendance today. And I think we can then get onto the agenda and make a note of the apologies for absence. So for absence, we've got Councillor Reid, Councillor Moran, we've got Bernadette Nesbitt and Sarah Smith, and also Andrea Parkinson. So now we need to consider the extent, if any, that the public and press are to be excluded from the meeting. And there are no issues on the agenda that would require any exclusion of the press or public. Right, so declarations of interest. If you have an interest, please declare this, and you will need a form to be completed following this meeting. Please contact Christine Rothwell, sat behind me, from Governance Team, and she can assist you. Minutes of the Children and Young People's Overview and Scrutiny panel meeting held on the 12th of December 2024. Are these agreed to be a correct record?
Agreed. Yeah.
Thank you. Is that seconded? Thank you. Okay, so as I stated before, we don't have any members of the public present, so we can move on from that part. And I would like to ask officers to introduce themselves, please. If we can probably start from that side, from Alison, and work the way around. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alison Tomes, Head of Service for Early Intervention and Prevention.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Shooter. I'm Domestic and Sexual Abuse Service Manager at the Council.
Hi, I'm Angus, and I'm from the Youth Council.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Halsby, Participation Officer in Partnerships and Engagement.
I'm Emma Smith. I'm the Head of Service for the MASH Children with Disabilities team, out of hours, and the Assessment Service for the Doncaster City Council.
Hi, good evening. My name is Helen Cooper. I'm Service Manager for the Intensive Prevention Service. The dance team sits within my portfolio.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Wall. I'm the Service Director for Children's Social Care.
Good evening, colleagues. Rihanna Nelson, Executive Director for Children, Young People and Families.
Okay, so I think we'll stay with Rihanna if you want to start. I'm told that we'll pass over to you, and then I think the Youth Council that's here has got a presentation. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and have a conversation around the impact of domestic abuse on our children and young people. We've got a bit of a partnership approach here. So Karen's lovely here as the lead for domestic abuse, and our colleagues from the Youth Council, who's going to showcase a little bit of the campaign that they ran. Is it a couple of years ago, a year ago? A couple of years ago now. And then we've got a short presentation just to kind of go through around the services and offer that's available for our children, young people, families that are unfortunately engaged in domestic abuse. Okay, so I'll hand over to Courtney and to get on with our little campaign.
Thank you. So good afternoon. It's great to be here today. I'll just say a quick hello again. I'm Angus and I'm from Doncaster Youth Council, and I represent the Home Educators of Doncaster. So today I'm here to present the Reduce Domestic Abuse campaign created by the Youth Council in 2022. Although this was a previous cohort of the Youth Council, the subject continues to be highly relevant today, hence why we repeatedly present it. This campaign was created before I became part of the Youth Council, but I would encourage any questions at the end and I'll do my best to answer them. So yeah, thank you. We'll get started. So how it started. This campaign was inspired by the results from the National Make Your Mark ballot in 2021 with 412 votes, where young people across Doncaster made it clear that domestic abuse and unhealthy relationships were major concerns for them. Our Youth Council members took these concerns to create a campaign that speaks directly to young people about the subtle but dangerous signs of coercive control so others can identify it. It's a deep dive. In partnership with the Domestic Abuse Hub, we shared a survey with young people across Doncaster to gain a better understanding of young people's thoughts. We gained just under 900 responses focusing on their understanding and experiences of domestic abuse and which aspects of domestic abuse were of most concern to young people. The top priorities young people identified was awareness around how to spot a controlling, unhealthy, toxic relationship and how to help a friend. So there's the amount of votes for each topic. Our campaign. So our campaign priority is empowering young people to identify red flags in relationships and feel confident in seeking support and understand that this kind of behaviour is not normal. With this being a very sensitive issue, we worked closely in partnership with the Domestic Abuse Service and Doncaster Children's Services Trust, ensuring we have specialist research and guidance. This led us to create the Red Flags film. We produced a short film with a local filmmaker titled Red Flags, scripted to highlight the signs to look for in relationships. It is inspired by real-life scenarios illustrating negative behaviours and its impacts, such as controlling who you talk to, tracking your location, or isolating you from your friends. The film is being used in schools, youth groups, and professional training sessions up and down the country to educate a wider audience, and has been well received by young people and professionals across Doncaster and beyond. We have reached over 80,000 people via YouTube and social media and showcased for a period in both Doncaster and cinemas. Yeah, so now we're just going to show you the Red Flags film. All the actors in this film were part of the previous Youth Council. So yeah, we'll just show that now.
I couldn't tell anyone. I was so embarrassed.
I thought I was going crazy. He said I was overreacting. No one knew what was happening. I couldn't tell anyone.
I guess I brushed it off. Try not to think about it. She would sneak out of class a lot and try and get my attention. My mates thought it was funny. She always wanted to know what I was doing, where I was going, texting me. It was intense.
What's that?
No, it's just me. He didn't like me having friends. He seemed a bit jealous. Like he wanted me to himself. All the time.
No, leave it.
I felt bad. Like I was ignoring my mates. But I didn't know how to explain that to him. Started making little comments about everything I did. If I was going out, he'd say my dress was a bit short.
You're actually gonna go out like that?
Tried to get me to wear what he wanted.
Look at yourself. Cover up.
He'd just get so mad, so quickly. That's when he would call me names. Say I looked ugly. I didn't know how much worse it would get.
None of it was for me, yeah, none of
She was always waiting for me outside school.
Guess we'll leave you to it then.
And the way she complimented me all the time, it was more about her. Things like, I'd die without you. It just made me feel uncomfortable.
I didn't see my friends as much. I remember he kept saying they weren't good for me. That they didn't even like me. I found out he was deleting messages from my phone. I lost a lot of friends that year. I knew he was going on my phone whenever I left the room. I don't even know how he knew my password.
You've got nothing to hide here.
He wanted to check my messages, photos, DMs, everything. It was like it was my fault for getting annoyed. I lost a lot of friends because of him. I didn't bring it up around him. I never knew how he'd react. He was always paranoid, and the smallest thing would set him off. I didn't know what he was capable of.
She never hit me, but she would shout a lot. She'd tell me she was sorry, she was stressed about exams, or having trouble at home. She was convincing. She made me think I was the one overreacting. To everyone else, it probably looked normal. But she was a different person when we were alone. I'm not afraid to admit I was scared of her.
He made me dependent on him. He wanted me all to himself.
She had control over everything I did.
He made sure I had no one else to turn to. He watched every move I made.
People wouldn't believe me if I told them.
Do I have the right to even be upset about this? It was all about controlling me.
She knew what she was doing.
I couldn't explain this to anyone. I didn't know how to get out.
I didn't know who to talk to.
If I had known sooner that I could talk to someone, who knows?
I found out it had a name, coercive control, and it is a form of domestic abuse. If you think you've been a victim of coercive control, call 01302 737 080 for confidential support, or call 01302 737777 to talk to someone about a red flag.
So yeah, that's the film. So our campaign also includes promotional materials such as posters and digital screens displayed across Doncaster to reach as many young people as possible. These materials being out in communities ensures that the message isn't just confined to classrooms or social media, it's out in public spaces where young people will see it in their everyday lives. A collection of designs were made themed with a different aspect of coercive controlling behaviour with a young person-friendly description of what it means. We commissioned local artists to develop an abstract art piece which was exhibited in Daylem Gallery Library and Museum. The painting features a striking eye emerging from a sky filled with both dark storm clouds and soft white clouds. The contrasting skies symbolise the journey from fear and uncertainty to hope and freedom. Within the lighter clouds, birds take flight, representing resilience, escape, and the possibility of a brighter future. Our campaign was nominated at the St Ledger Homes Tenants' Choice Awards in 2022. We were runners-up for Community Project of the Year, which was amazing. So although this campaign was developed in 2022, we continue to share our resources and campaign messages. Together we can make sure every young person knows they deserve a relationship built on respect, happiness and trust. So yeah, that's the end. And if anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angus, for presenting that. And I'd just like to say thank you to all the youth councillors that were involved in that film and all the hard work that went into that. 'Cause, yeah, it's a couple of years ago, but I remember when they came to showcase it here a couple of years ago, excited about it being sort of premiered at the Savoy Cinema and like saying on cider buses and everything. I'm going to go around now and just let councillors and the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll see if anybody's got any questions. But yeah, just to take the opportunity to thank you for all your hard work, and Courtney and all the team and all the previous youth councillors as well. I'm sure many of them have moved on to better things, but yeah, it's a credit. They're a credit to Doncaster, so thank you for that. So I didn't introduce myself earlier, but I'm Leanne Hempshaw. I represent Roman Ridge Ward and I chair this panel, and I'll pass you to my vice chair.
Hi, excuse me. My name's Councillor Tim Needham and I represent Armthorpe Ward. Thank you.
Antoinette Drinkle, Co-op T, representing the Anglican Diocese of Sheffield.
Councillor Susan Durant and I represent the Thornham Lawrence Ward.
Councillor David Nevitt, represent the Edenthorpe and Kirksandall Ward.
Councillor Laura Bluff, representing Bessica Ward.
Councillor Steve Cox, Finley Ward, and thank you very much, that was brilliant.
Bob Anderson, Roslington Bawtry in Austerfield Ward, thank you.
Charlie Hogarth, Bentley Ward.
Has anybody on the panel got any questions for Angus?
Not a question, but I thought it was very good, and I'm hoping it's made a lot of difference to people's lives who've watched it and the way they've done.
Just at the beginning, you said you shared a survey. So who did you target with that survey?
Yeah, so I believe, Karen, did it go out to schools across Doncaster? Because we did that in conjunction with yourselves, didn't we? Yeah, of course, you can jump in.
Yeah, absolutely indebted to the Youth Council, really, because we'd already tried to do some survey work with young people around healthy and unhealthy relationships, and we'd not really got a fantastic response. As soon as we got the Youth Council on, who really grabbed hold of the survey, made sure it was in language that was appropriate for young people, so really helped us to tweak and design the survey, and then took it out to the schools and encouraged schools to respond. And I think we went from having a handful of responses to over 900. So I think that's one of the best survey results we've ever had, which is fantastic.
Can I just ask, was the film sort of shown in all schools at the time?
So the film was promoted. The Youth Council helped us to get the film out to schools, and then shortly after we developed the domestic and sexual abuse toolkit for educational establishments, and we did a launch of that where we again showed the Youth Council film. And then we deliver, on a rolling programme, we deliver lots of domestic abuse training. So the film is shown to professionals who complete who complete the domestic abuse training. And then our workforce development officer also goes regularly to designate safeguarding leads within schools. So again, whenever she's delivering that training, it's shown again in schools. But we do, and as part of the toolkit, as part of the work we do with schools, we encourage them to show that video to new cohorts that are coming through, so it'll have some longevity to it.
And can I also ask, do we know if this, you might not know this, but is something similar being done elsewhere, like across the country, or do you think that Doncaster are pioneers in this sort of work with Youth Council?
We're definitely pioneers. I'm not aware of it happening, but I've certainly had approaches from lots of other councils who are interested in it. And we were asked to speak at a national conference by the Local Government Association. So that was a couple of years ago now. So it was showcased and featured in the conference and in the Local Government Association journal as well.
Obviously the film's aimed at older young people rather than the younger young people. Is there anything that's kind of around or used or effectively able to be promoted in primary schools?
Yes, so schools now have to deliver age-appropriate healthy relationship education. That's primary and secondary schools. So with the primary schools, it's more around what a good friend is like, and kind of that respect and friendship. So it's all age-appropriate. But there is a programme delivered by Alicia's team, who's under Helen, called One of a Kind, which is for primary schools, and it's kind of targeted at primary school age children who have been in households where there's domestic abuse. But yeah, there's quite a lot of resources available. Learn Sheffield have developed quite a lot of lesson plans for all key stages that can be used. They're free to all of our schools. So again, we launched those at when we launched the toolkit, and they're included within the toolkit. So there's lots of lesson plans. And if anybody's really interested, it's not for young, it's not to be shown to young people or primary school age children, but there's a fantastic film called Timekeeper. It's about 20 minutes long. If you just Google Timekeeper, it's really good, and we use that with schools and teachers, and it's around the impact of domestic abuse on a primary school age child. There is a trigger warning. It's really, really quite upsetting, but it does the job in terms of helping professionals understand the impact of domestic abuse on children.
It's fantastic that you got the cinemas involved to be able to show it. Given October is Awareness Month for Domestic Violence, is there any chance of the cinemas running this on an annual basis, that they would run it every October? Maybe, obviously film appropriate ones in the trailer section, I'm assuming is when it was run before. Is there anything like that on the cards to, keep it going?
We were really lucky actually to get some funding from the South Yorkshire Violence Reduction Unit to pay for both development of the film and to fund it to go in the cinemas. There isn't a sort of budget to allow us to do that, but as it happens, next week we'll be delivering some workshops around the new action plan for domestic abuse and for sexual abuse as well. So I'll take that and I'll put that forward as a suggestion for if we're able to get some funding for it. The film that you've just seen there, that's the full film, but there was a shortened version that was shown in the cinemas, but still just as effective. But yeah, I would love to get that. And if there are anybody who's got any links to the cinemas and we can twist their arm to show it, then let me know.
Yeah, it's interesting you say you don't have the funding, but in an ideal world you wouldn't need that funding, because you think that, quite happily offer that as in a trailer, as you suggest. It's a really good idea. So it might be up to one of us to take that forward. Can I just, before we move on, and we've got obviously the questions that we put forward before this meeting, but just going back to what you said about, you said primary school children that have experienced domestic abuse, would be maybe sort of shown the film, or, but do you mean those particularly, or do you just mean generally to primary school? Because there will be, you know, certain children that are experiencing it that nobody knows that. So I guess I'm kind of thinking of talking about primary school. It's that sort of idea of they often think that that is just normal, you know, until they get older and they start seeing and speaking and realising that the peer group, they don't encounter these types of things in the home, then, and what they might see externally, you know, online or whatever. So it's, what did you mean particularly the ones that you know of that have gone through the system, if you like, or would that be shown just generally to a class, and then that might make that young person feel they can come forward and say, well, actually, this is happening at home, you know?
I'm really mindful that we're getting into quite a bit of detail, which I think is covered in some of the questions, but I'll give a really brief answer. So I think what Karen was inferring is a power, you know, that film is really powerful, and with power, we need to be really careful for young children. I think what we do is work really closely with early help colleagues. We've got a continuum of support, recognising that for some children, domestic abuse might be part of their life, but also parental conflict can be just as damaging. And what's the difference between parental conflict where parents aren't getting on, what's domestic abuse, that definition. So what we do is work really closely with schools to enable teachers, support staff to be able to recognise the signs, to be able to talk. We do the healthy relationship work within school settings. We do talk about domestic abuse without labelling it that. So I do think we try to work with those children connected to make sure they've got an avenue and an openness to talk through. You'll see on the slides we refer to Operation Encompass. Operation Encompass is really important about how professionals can alert a school to something happening in a home, and helping teachers be aware and mindful of that, so that if that child is struggling. We do also have people that isn't necessarily about a child or parent telling us. Sometimes that's a member of their community and their family that's letting us know. So we do try to wrap around and work really closely to help identify those children that might be struggling. Alicia's team, the DANS team, also does their typology training, and that's connected into schools, which is about recognising the different forms of abuse. So we recognise that people like staff in schools see our children an awful lot more than we do, early years, and the Parental Conflict Project is really also about training up those first responders, so that the police, or if it's somebody in the community, such as a health visitor, can really engage with parents and say, well, you might not see this as domestic abuse, your children are caught up in conflict, that has an emotional impact. So we do have a really good continuum of support and recognition of how life can be really complicated for children caught up in adult conflict or adult violence, and we try to work really in an understanding, trauma-informed, trauma-aware way, and use the professionals around children to watch out for those signs, understand, recognise that when, you know, parents might be fighting, what's the response, how can we connect with services at all the different levels.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, but what I'm getting at is, what if it's before those signs are there? So often children mask, or they could just not be showing the signs. So if you're waiting for those signs, that can often be maybe too late, because they've already could have been living that life for years before they'll open up and show. I mean, what is a sign? We, you know, generally what it is, but you know, no two children are the same. So I just thought it'd be good to sort of blanket it and put it out there. I don't know. I mean, we talk about primary school children, but I think you said you don't show that video of young people. Is that too old, what we've just watched, for a primary school child? I don't know. Yeah? Okay, so have you got a question, Councillor Cox?
Thanks. Yeah, it's more about children in special educational needs venues, if you like. How do we address it with that? Because like Chair's just said, I mean, children mask to do different things, don't they? And when you've got a child with special educational needs, that masking and that, it wouldn't seem to be as clear, because there may be various reasons why that's happening. What kind of training's in there for staff within that school?
So I think one of the things that we need to recognise is that when you build trusted relationships with children, they tend to talk about things that they think are normal. So I do think there's an element of masking, but masking's quite sophisticated. You sometimes have had to have a direct influence from a parent saying, don't go to school and don't talk about this. So our children in special educational needs schools often have a group of people around them that know that child and that family actually quite well. And in terms of their interaction coming up, picking kids up from school, taking them home, understanding how they communicate when they're distressed. And if a child with special educational needs that is perhaps non-verbal is distressed, then the staff would be connecting with early help colleagues, potentially safeguarding colleagues, and saying, we've got a really distressed child here in terms of their presentation. I appreciate what you're saying about they might not be showing the signs, but we're training teachers and staff around children to be alert of how children talk about their relationships and what's normal and what's normal, a bit like that coercive control. We talk about what does a healthy family look like. We talk about that. We listen to friends. We try to make sure we communicate. Can't undervalue the work that our schools do in recognising, supporting and enabling us to know the lives and worlds of children. And I think we do try to open up those conversations, provide the toolkit, as Karen said, to enable child appropriate, your PHSE, for example, about what a healthy relationship looks like, to maybe open up that world a little bit to go, my house doesn't look like that. That doesn't feel like that for me. And they might not say that to a child, to a teacher, they might say that to a child, for example, a friend. So it is keeping our eye out for those children that might be isolated, that can't communicate, what are the changes in their behaviour. Domestic abuse is like very many other forms of abuse. We're good at watching out and looking out for signs, and that doesn't need to be signs of being aggressive or lashing out. It can just be that child's quieter than normal. Let's know a little bit more about why that child's quiet. So it is about professional curiosity, knowing that child and that world, and really making sure professionals have got time and the skill set to do that. But it is complex, and I appreciate, we hope that we know and can help every child live a life free from domestic abuse. That's our aim, but we want to make sure that staff around those children are skilled to spot it.
It's perhaps a comment rather than a question, really. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the fact that you're also dealing with perpetrators here, and coercive relationships start often as young children being coercive friends and thinking that that behaviour is perhaps the norm. Maybe it's what they see at home or they've seen other people do. So I think it's just as important to kind of highlight the work that schools and professionals do with perpetrator. Sounds like an awful word, doesn't it? But the young people who don't suddenly become coercive models of behaviour, actually start that at a very young age. So identifying and working with them, not just the victims of this, is really, really important to try and break that cycle, because that's where you break the cycle, when it starts, not 10, 20 years down the line.
Thank you, Antoinette. So I think it leaves us to thanking Angus for representing the Youth Council today. You've done a brilliant job. Thank you so much, and thank you for attending. I don't know if you want to stay for the rest of the meeting, or you're free to go, obviously, whenever you want. So I'm going to pass over to the team now. I think, did you say you're doing a presentation? And then we've got our questions that we've got already. Thank you.
So while we're getting the presentation set up, I just want to do just a very brief bit of an introduction. Kind of smiled when I got given this task of children and domestic abuse and families, because I really need to highlight that it is one of those complex issues that goes across a number of our systems and a number of our governance. So I'm very, very appreciative of Karen stepping into this space and coming in and talking you guys through why it's such a priority for the whole community in Doncaster, for our adults, our parent carers and our children. And what we've tried to do is give you a little bit of a flavour of how we respond, and to give you some sense of what we think we're successful at, but also where we know that we still need to grow, and really welcome your questions and feedback back about, do you think that we are achieving some of that? If there's stuff that you think that we could stretch better at, that good challenge back would be really helpful, particularly given what you know from your residents and constituents as well, which I think is really important. So it is just, how could I give you a flavour of what we do and how we respond without drowning you in lots of different figures and facts. So it's just a bit of an overview, which is why I've brought so many of my colleagues with me, because it's definitely an area that stretches us and moves across systems. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you've got the presentation in front of you. If not, we will try and talk through it as much as possible. I'm going to start off the first couple of slides, really just to set the scene so that we can talk you through a little bit of the governance in terms of where this sits. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to talk through their individual sections in terms of how we respond. So if we move on to the first slide, that really reflects our current multi-agency safeguarding arrangements, including how we gather together in a South Yorkshire footing, the Doncaster Safeguarding Children Executive, the fact that we also have a connection with domestic abuse across to the Doncaster Safeguarding Adults Board, Community Safety Partnership and the Health and Wellbeing Board. The first slide shows you the makeup of the DSCP executive, and what you'll notice is there isn't a dedicated group that necessarily meets in relation to children and domestic abuse under this governance. There's a bit of a dotted line that actually goes through to the Doncaster Community Safeguarding Partnership and the strategy in relation to Safer Stronger Doncaster Partnership, and underneath there sits the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategic Board, which is laid out on slide 2. So that kind of shows you some of the nuts and bolts about how we ensure that we've got a really clear governance process in relation to domestic abuse. So if I think about it, how I always describe this is some of the people that pose a risk of harm, which is how Alicia Lee has always encouraged me to think of what is usually known as a perpetrator of domestic abuse. A lot of that focus tends to sit in the Safer Domestic Partnership, which is about safer communities, creating safer lives. In terms of the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, we obviously focus much more on children and the response to domestic abuse, getting caught up in parental conflict, both the indirect and direct impact. And then, as highlighted in the domestic abuse strategy, there is the recently revamped Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategic Board. Bringing together domestic abuse and sexual abuse is a really important recent development, which I think has been very positive. We then have the Domestic Abuse Operational Board, which has the MARAC steering group that sits underneath it. So MARAC is a particular process around how we ensure that any adults that are caught up in domestic abuse, both the person posing a risk, the victim, and if they have any children, are considered at an operational level so that we can be assured that they have safety plans in place. That might also include somebody that isn't necessarily in the relationship with the person posing a risk of harm, but they may have joint children that may be seeing that individual. So it's really quite a robust process. We then have the Domestic Homicide Review Panel, which is the process where if anybody is sadly killed linked to domestic abuse, that is the review panel process. You'll then see the Children and Domestic Abuse subgroup, which is really the bit that connects us into the DSCP. So that's where we try to work on a multi-agency partnership footing to ensure that we've got good oversight around the processes and partners in terms of how we respond. That's currently chaired by my strategic lead, which is Anchester Walsh, and that tends to meet on a 6 to 8 weekly basis. And then we have the Performance and QA subgroup. So that's kind of the main governance in relation to where we sit around domestic abuse. And then what I'm probably going to do is hand over here to Karen, because this is definitely her world in terms of ensuring the priorities, if that's all right, Karen.
Yeah, no problem. So in the domestic abuse strategy that was launched in 2021, we set out 4 priority areas. So prevention, keeping victims and families safe, holding abusers to account, and then the governance and accountability. But from the graphic that you can see in your packs, they're obviously all interlinked. So the next slide talks about the prevention work. You've obviously seen the preventative work that we've done with the Youth Council, that we do with schools around the education, training for educational staff, and the domestic and sexual abuse educational toolkit. So that's what classes kind of that primary prevention, so preventing it from happening in the first place. But there's lots of secondary prevention as well, so preventing victims from being abused again. So we do a lot of awareness campaigns so that we can help people identify what domestic abuse is, make sure that they know what the referral pathways are so they can get some support to prevent further incidents and escalation of domestic abuse. We've got a community engagement worker who has done some absolutely amazing work going out to different community groups, to schools, to local businesses, to educate the wider communities in what domestic abuse is, healthy relationships, and again that referral pathways, to kind of create this culture where we don't tolerate domestic abuse. We've got, I think, one of the best training packages available in terms of for domestic abuse, where we talk about, we've got domestic abuse awareness, we've got training on risk assessment, and then we look at some more in-depth training around, for example, male victims, older victims with care and support needs, children and young people, forced marriage, honour-based abuse, female genital mutilation, and so on. It's a fantastic package of support that we've got available. So that's kind of what we've got within the prevention arm of the strategy. Then, under keeping victims and families safe, one of the things that we developed quite a few years ago was the domestic abuse protocol. That was to try and ensure that we've got consistency across the whole partnership in terms of identifying risk, assessing risk and managing risk, and providing support to victims and survivors. So that's really our go-to reference document that we try and keep updated and ensure that professionals are aware of it. We've got the Domestic Abuse Hub, which is a one-stop shop for victims who either want to self-refer or for professionals to refer in to get some support for victims. We've got our Independent Domestic Violence Advocate Service, or IDVA service, who work now, we've just finished restructuring the service, and they work with any victim of domestic abuse. Previously it was high-risk victims. We now have an all-risk model. So regardless of what your circumstances are, you can get a fully qualified and trained independent domestic violence advocate. We've got, again, we're leading the way on this, I think, in terms of working with survivors of domestic abuse to ensure that we've got the voices of survivors embedded and at the heart of everything we do. So we collaborate, we consult, we engage with survivors, but we also provide ongoing support for people who are still not being abused anymore, but are still dealing with the long-lasting impact of the trauma that they've experienced. We've got a multi-agency risk assessment conference, and that is where all of our high-risk victims of domestic abuse are heard, and that's a multi-agency approach to being able to manage the risks. So we look at the victim, the perpetrator and the children at the multi-agency risk assessment conference. So far this financial year, so the first 3 quarters, we've had around 700 high-risk victims of domestic abuse go to our MARAC. We work closely with the independent charity, Phoenix Women's Aid, who provide a range of services, and people can go directly to Phoenix Women's Aid, or they can contact the hub and get, and we will sometimes, with consent, send referrals over to Phoenix Women's Aid, who we work closely with as well. Obviously recognising that sexual abuse can be part of domestic abuse. If somebody's been a victim of sexual abuse as well, we work with our specialists at DRASAC, so Doncaster Rape and Sexual Abuse Counselling Services. We work really closely with them. And then we've got hospital domestic abuse workers, and this is again part of the ensuring that we've got a coordinated community response to domestic abuse. It's not a council responsibility, a police responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility. Doncaster Bassett Law Teaching Hospital were successful in securing some funding to have 2 domestic abuse specialists located within the hospital to help train staff, get domestic abuse champions throughout the hospital, and also support victims that are coming through as well. Training Again, we've got our domestic abuse training offer, but we recently had some training from Professor Jane Monckton-Smith, who's done an amazing, it's a fantastic book, and she's produced a homicide timeline where there's 8 stages which help us to be able to identify risks and escalation in risk to hopefully help us prevent homicides. So we've just trained across South Yorkshire. We had about 500 people trained across South Yorkshire in homicide and suicide timeline. We commission safe accommodation for people who have to flee domestic abuse. Ideally, we want to prevent it before it gets to that stage. We don't want to displace anybody who's, a victim of domestic abuse. So we will, but occasionally we have to do so. So we've got safe accommodation services. The domestic abuse navigator service, which I'm not going to touch on because I know my colleagues are going to go through that, and the community engagement work and the one of a kind. That's all part of the domestic abuse navigator service. And then not forgetting perpetrators of domestic abuse as well. It's really important that we hold abusers to account and we work with them to help them identify their behaviour, challenge that behaviour, and hopefully tackle it to prevent further abuse. And one of the things that, again, I think we are leading the way on is trying to identify who are serial perpetrators of domestic abuse. So those people who go from one victim to another victim to another victim to another victim. So we're trying to ensure that we've got eyes on them and we're working proactively so they don't target and abuse other people. Which leads on to the next slide around, that's the serial perpetrator work we're doing. And then there's lots of other interventions in terms of working with perpetrators or trying to prevent perpetrator harm. So we've got things like domestic violence disclosure scheme, which you might know as Clare's Law, where if somebody's worried about the person that they're in a relationship with, they can contact the police and ask the police if they've got any relevant information that might suggest that they pose a risk to them. So there's 2 routes on the domestic violence disclosure scheme. You can do a right to ask, anybody can ask the police of that information, and we've got right to know. So if a professional is aware that somebody is a person that could cause them harm, we can also approach the police, and the police will do it themselves as well, and contact the victim to let them know that this person is a perpetrator of domestic abuse. I spoke a minute ago about sanctuary schemes and hopefully preventing people. Sometimes people have to go into safe accommodation, but there are also things that we can do to try and move the perpetrator away from the family home as well, which include things like domestic violence protection notices and orders where we can remove the perpetrator from the family home for up to 28 days. And then there are initiatives like Level Up and Inspire to Change, which are programs that work with people who are causing harm, again, to be able to help them understand that their behaviour is not acceptable and then to challenge and address that behaviour. So we commission both Level Up and Level Up and Inspire to Change, and then the Domestic Abuse Navigator service deliver Caring Dads and Getting On, and I know we've got a presentation on that. We do a lot of campaign work as well as part of the strategy, so a lot of the work is focused on targeting general members of our community, but also targeting victims and survivors, but we also do some targeted work around perpetrator behaviour as well. Particularly did a lot of work around that with the European Football Championships and World Cups when we know we get a spike in abuse. And then dispelling some myths around things like alcohol and drug use, and that they're not excuses for abusive behaviours. And then again, part of that coordinated community response, Domestic Abuse Matters, or DA Matters, is a nationally recognised training programme for police officers, and South Yorkshire Police are ensuring that all of their police officers are trained in domestic abuse matters. And then the next slide is the governance and leadership. So again, it's about making sure that we've got a really, really strong partnership that we hold ourselves to account, that we are monitoring performance, that we have robust and smart action plans, that we are looking at quality assurance, that we're getting feedback from victims and survivors. We do things like the PIN badge. I'm wearing my PIN badge today. We've got over 1,600 domestic abuse PIN badge wearers now. If you see somebody wearing this badge, it means that they're trained in domestic abuse and that they know how to get you the right support. So again, trying to break those barriers down to people reporting, because we know how difficult it is. And we've got a domestic abuse charter, so we've got a set of standards for any organisation and community group who wants to achieve domestic abuse charter status. There are a few standards and hoops that they have to jump through before we will award them charter status. Again, it's part of that coordinated community response and everybody's responsibility. And then not forgetting intersectionality. So we know how difficult it is for victims of domestic abuse to access support. It can be even more difficult if you've got somebody with from a minority community, for example. If you are LGBT, there are additional risks and different ways of different forms of abuse that might affect you. If you are a deaf victim, for example, or somebody with a learning disability, there are additional barriers and risks and things that we need to think about. So we do a lot of work around trying to reach every single member of Doncaster to make sure that we target our comms, our information, that our staff are trained. So we've done a lot of training for our domestic abuse team on various different aspects of this. We've got a young people's worker, we've got a Gypsy Roma traveller worker, we've had immigration training, deaf and hard of hearing training, and we ensure that all of our practitioners are trauma informed as well, and understand engagement or lack of engagement, and we don't judge, and we try and remove barriers as much as we possibly can. I think that's me done.
Thank you very much, Karen.
What does DHR mean?
Sorry, I'm terrible with abbreviations. DHRs are domestic homicide reviews. So whenever there is somebody who...
I just need to know what the letter stood for.
Yeah.
QA?
Quality assurance.
Performance and quality assurance. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I've got a question. I'm happy to hear that work's informed by affected people. I think that's quite important. So I'm happy to hear that. But before the 4 principles can be put into practice, there needs to be people coming forward. So in terms of the pathway, is the referral pathway known and used by affected people, members of family or networks, or the public alongside professionals? How does that work? How do people know?
So because we've got the domestic abuse hub, it means we've got one telephone number, which makes it a lot easier for us to do the comms. We've done some surveys, and we're still finding that people don't necessarily know what support is available. But I am absolutely in awe of the council's comms team, because we work really closely with our comms team, and there is a continual drip of information going out in residents' newsletters, on Facebook, on the council's X account, anywhere and everywhere we get information out. Also, it's the referral pathways are included within the domestic abuse training that we deliver. In every meeting, it's kind of everywhere. And especially with the community engagement work as well that my colleague Angie Emerton does, going out to businesses. We've got lots of businesses now with domestic abuse posters in the windows. We've got community groups who have achieved charter status. We've got community groups and voluntary groups who are trained in domestic abuse as well. So we're doing everything we possibly can to try and get that information out there. But we've got to keep at it. We've got to keep doing it all the time. But what I'm really pleased to see is we have had an increase in self-referrals. So and what we monitor with the self-referrals is where people heard about us. So we know who's referring in, we know which agencies are referring in and which ones aren't. And we also know where the self-referrals are coming from and how they heard about us. That helps us monitor which agencies or which areas we need to target to do some more comms work.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking on top of my head here. Is it informed by the people who have been affected who are part of your process? Are you asking their opinions about what they may wanted previously or how they accessed? And I'm sure you are.
Absolutely. So our survivor liaison work and the work that we do with experts by experience, we run a lot of our majority of our comms work and the messages that we give out, we run through our survivor liaison service and our experts by experience. We've just refreshed our website as well, having worked with some survivors of domestic abuse from Phoenix Women's Aid who've received support from there. What they were telling us is that family and friends don't necessarily know how to support their family and friends who have been victims of domestic abuse. And although we'd got information on our website, it was really difficult to find. So we've been working on a family and friends campaign to be able to ensure that family and friends can also support better. But also we've taken their feedback and completely refreshed the website to make it much cleaner, much easier to find the information and access the information. But if anybody's got any other feedback, we're like sponges. We like to draw it all in.
Can I also just jump in and say that it is a partnership and community effort as well? So I know that Karen's Bit of the World works really closely with police. So we know that there's often a spike in domestic abuse around certain times of the year. Football matches are a big trigger. So I think there's really careful consideration each year about when are we going to do some potential comms. I think also GP surgeries, working through our health colleagues. There's lots of community-based activity. The content that we do put in school foyers as well sometimes where it feels safe and appropriate to do so for parents. And just from a children's point of view, Operation Encompass does give us a bit of a window into what's happening in children's lives. And sometimes that contact might not be a children's social care response, it might be an early help response. So we try to just take those opportunities, create a real continuum of support. And you're going to hear a bit from Phoenix Women's Aid, and I know IDAS, who are also doing their community awareness as well through their groups and their funding that they have access to. So it is very much a full partnership, community-based effort.
Just my question carries on from that, really, thinking about intersectionality. It's often older people who are the hidden, secret group of people that really don't get identified and struggle to identify themselves as being a victim. Are we quite successful in supporting victims of domestic violence around that older age group people?
Yeah, we are. We tend to get a number of referrals through the safeguarding route, through adult safeguarding. So we do work closely with the adult safeguarding team. We also work with organisations like Citizens Advice Bureau. One of the organisations that we've had contact with in the past, and I'm looking to re-establish some more contact, is organisations like Age UK as well. So yeah, we have got a breakdown of age groups for people that come through the domestic abuse hub, and a lot of the older people as well that we do support are referrals from the police very often, and it can be obviously partner abuse, but we do tend to see a lot of adult child is what I mean, or grandchildren who are abusing older parents, who are abusing parents or grandparents. So we talk a lot about intimate partner violence, but domestic abuse is so much wider. We do a lot of work around familial abuse as well. And one of the scenarios actually in the new film that we launched back in October is around a familial abuse situation with an older woman who's being abused by either a daughter or granddaughter. So we've tried, with the film that we've just co-produced with survivors, we've tried to make as many scenarios that we think will relate to as many people as we possibly can. But more work to do, definitely.
Hi, yeah, it's just on the Clare's Law thing, the right to ask. So if someone's got a concern about a partner, a new partner, whatever, you say it'd be the police they'd contact. So if that person has got a history of domestic abuse, would that information always be relayed back to the person who's asked?
Not always. The police would make an informed decision, and it also depends whether the individual's, still in a relationship with them, planning to continue that relationship. So the police make that decision around it. I like Clare's Law. I think it's a really good initiative. But I think my only concern is if you've got that gut feeling, or there are some signs and concerns, and you do a Clare's Law and nothing comes back, that does not necessarily mean that they are not causing harm to you. It just means that they haven't gone through the criminal justice system for it before. And we know that only about a fifth of domestic abuse is reported to the police. So, yeah, it's a great tool, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And if anybody is worried that they're in an abusive or unhealthy relationship, then I'd ask them to reach out and speak to the Domestic Abuse Hub.
Can I just bring it back to, we are here to represent, or hear from a perspective of children and young people. I know it's often going to sort of go into adult world, but I just wondered, from what the conversation's been going, is how reactive are we to, not in Doncaster, but when we hear news stories of, say, like the 15-year-old girl that was stabbed by a boyfriend, as we want to call it, and the family said that they were reaching out and there were red flags in their relationship, but because they were sort of under 16, it wasn't treated in the same way as a normal domestic abuse case would be, or coercive behaviour. So although that didn't happen in Doncaster, I'm just wondering, are we reactive with things like that? Are we, obviously we're aware of it, but what can we put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen and we're not turning the news on and that's happened here in Doncaster?
I think what we need to recognise is that is a child and it needs to go through the safeguarding system in relation to a strategy discussion. That doesn't mean that the person posing a risk of harm would be dealt with differently because they're a child. It would be around recognising that safeguarding process, which actually has a much lower threshold for intervention potentially than domestic abuse. Sometimes with domestic abuse you're looking for a pattern or you're looking for a severity of action. So for me it's a bit about how that was unpicked in terms of the child protection response, but obviously that's a concern. I think it comes back to the training. One of the things that I will say, and I am going to blow Dan's trumpet, is some of the training that's been delivered, the typology training, is phenomenal. It's been recognised recently as really positive on a national level. It looks at all the different behaviours that somebody that's coercive, controlling, abusive might display. And we've cascaded that out to half of our children's social care workforce. We've delivered that to the DSL network, the Designated School Lead Network. It comes as part of a toolkit, so you can go on to share that. And that's how we change the response, which is saying this might have strands of domestic abuse in relation to a child on child. That's a child safeguarding issue. And what are the things that we can use that mirror a response in a domestic abuse situation that would stop somebody posing a risk to somebody else? But I think that's our position. They are children, so we respond through that process first. And it's really sad to hear that circumstance and that response. But I think it is a very different scenario. But domestic abuse is very complex these days, I think, as Karen has alluded to, and I think we're really skilled about recognising it, naming it. We do offer a MAREC process to children that are 16 upwards. So they're very often on that cusp of adulthood because they could go and live together if they chose to. That would be classed as a MARAC process. So we do look for 16 upwards. We don't tend to do it below. But ultimately a MARAC is a strategy discussion for adults that may be a victim or pose a risk. So in some ways it's the same threshold of concern. Some of that is about, have we seen the signs, have we responded, but that's about skilling staff up, first responders, second responders, and those assessing risk. So I think we're in a growingly positive place to recognise that.
Thank you. It's unfortunate that that girl was 15, so she would have slipped through the net, or like she did anyway. But yeah, it's interesting that it starts at 16, so thank you for that. Do you want to come in, Councillor Cox?
Thank you. Couple of bits, but leaflets, can we have some, please? And we'll put them up in our parish notice boards and things, because we don't have a family hub as such in part of our ward. So if you can have them, and I don't know how I'll get them, but just give us a shout, I'll pick them up. But just, sorry, Karen, sorry. Learning disability, people with learning disabilities and domestic abuse can normally manifest as a financial fraud. But what do we do with that? Because we know that that happens, and from personal experience, I suppose, we a resident, that you report it into St Ledger, or you report it, and then there's a hell of an argument to try and get somebody to look at it. How would that come across to your team? Because it turned out to be domestic violence, and it's similar to cuckooing, isn't it? Where you've got that, and that happens, same as you said, we older people, and can you go to the shop and go get me money for me? We'll never come back. But, you know, we know that that happens, but that is a form of domestic violence. So how do you deal with that? Is that through St Ledger's initiatives, or is it a police thing, or, you know, how does it work? And just finally, you mentioned managing risk. It sounds like a big entity, that, to manage a risk. You have to know the risk first, don't you, to manage it? How would you deal with such a massive thing? Because it isn't focused in one direction, is it? It's an issue that just scatters all over the place, and you can't know all the risks. So how on earth do you deal with it? Thank you, and over a bit there.
So in terms of the financial abuse, again, financial abuse within a domestic abuse situation is part of the training that we offer. So it really, I think everything really comes down to training and awareness. So it's for those agencies to identify that it's happening. And domestic abuse is ultimately around that power and control, whether it be emotional, financial, sexual, physical. It's about that power and control. And if somebody is withholding money, or building up gambling debts in somebody's name, or preventing somebody from work, or taking their benefits, or whatever it might be, that's a form of domestic abuse if it's within an intimate relationship or a familial relationship. So again, I would say either if you're a professional, refer it into the Domestic Abuse Hub, or if you're worried about it yourself, then contact the Domestic Abuse Hub for advice. There's also a really good national organisation called Surviving Economic Abuse, who have got some fantastic resources and deliver some really good training. So we are looking at doing some more training for our professionals on financial and economic abuse as well. And I say that one of the films that we've done is around exactly that kind of economic abuse or financial abuse between a daughter and mum. And then in terms of managing risk, so identification is the main thing to start off with. So we use something called a DASH risk assessment. So domestic abuse, stalking and honour-based abuse. It's a set of 27 questions. And we train professionals in asking those questions. It's really important that we don't use it as a tick box exercise. It's about having a conversation, but there are certain key risks within that domestic abuse risk assessment tool that help us really unpick what's happening in that relationship. So it asks about fear, it asks about what's happened within the relationship, asks about physical abuse, history of abuse with the perpetrator, any sort of exacerbating factors like drugs and alcohol, whether somebody's pregnant or had a child recently, because we know domestic abuse increases during that time. So it goes through a number of areas, and then it's part of a wider conversation about what's going on. When we've got that information, we can help give the right advice, we can provide options, we can encourage reporting to the police, gathering of evidence, which helps obviously with prosecution, options around where to stay safe, how to stay safe. We've got safety planning booklets. We've got a safe at home scheme where we can help secure a property so people don't feel as though they've got to leave out, so we can change locks, we can put lock chains on, we can give panic alarms, sometimes people want to put CCTV up and things like that. So yeah, it's around those understanding domestic abuse, understanding the risks, identifying the risk, assessing the risk, managing the risk, and working in partnership.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see your passion in this, and I know you all work hard. I do want to just focus on children and young people and how that affects, how this affects them. I know that Communities Environment panel, really this does come under, and they have touched on this subject in the past. So I do want to just keep it, if we can, to the effects on children and young people. And can I ask that, I know you've got the presentation, but everybody's read these. So if you could just maybe highlight the main bits that you want to highlight going forward, because I'm just aware of time and everything. So I'll let you continue with that. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I think the next slide just, it's come from Phoenix Refuge, which is one of the refuges that works locally with Doncaster families. The other is IDAS, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. But we just wanted to give a flavour of what's actually supported and commissioned by the Safer Doncaster response, because it is in part funded by council money in the sense of ensuring that we create places of sanctuary, as Karen really helpfully calls them. And obviously they also have outreach that supports people that aren't necessarily ready for the refuge. So that slide just gives you a little bit of a flavour in terms of the different types of offer that they have in place and that they support. Particularly as well for some of our families that don't have recourse to public funds, which is really important because that creates another level of vulnerability. I'm going to come over to Alison and I'm going to ask her to summarise the slides in relation to early help and just kind of take us on that journey of what's our kind of universal offer to families, how do we make sure that we recognise and respond appropriately to parental conflict, and then we'll kind of ebb on to kind of what our more bespoke response is for those families where we do have more of a concern that children are experiencing harm as a result of that domestic abuse. Is that okay? So I'll hand over to Alison.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So my world, I work in the early intervention and prevention space. So I have worked with Karen and Alicia and Helen's team to develop a relationship spectrum. So what does a relationship look like, in thinking about that from a respectful, equal, cooperative relationship all the way through to high-risk domestic abuse relationship, so that we're really clear that parental conflict and the support we do around healthy relationships is not domestic abuse. And the minute it steps into that fear element, that coercive control element, then we have to go down the identification of risk around domestic abuse. So I am really pleased in the offer that we have in Doncaster in terms of having a local offer, an early intervention offer, and then some specialist support about healthy relationships. And I think just bringing that back into children, there was a really growing body of evidence around the impact of interparental relationships and that harm that causes for children. So thinking about it puts children more at risk of having problems with school and learning, negative peer relationships, physical health problems, smoking and some substance misuse, mental health and well-being challenges, and longer-term health impacts as well, and poor future relationship chances, and obviously thinking about that, how children develop and what they see in terms of relationships with their peers. It reduces that academic attainment, it lowers the employability, heightened interpersonal violence and depression and anxiety. And there's a growing body of evidence around parental conflict. And I think I just wanted to, if I have time, just to read out the definition of what parental conflict is. And that can include regular bickering, arguing, frustration with each other about issues such as money, parenting and housework. When a child experiences this conflict frequently, and it is unresolved, it can result in children feeling upset, confused and angry, and their ability to resolve relationship problems throughout their lives and achieve positive outcomes. It then links into some of the longer term issues that we've seen for children. So I think we are really passionate about making sure we've got a really good offer around healthy relationships. We have a local offer. We've worked with our partners in Yorkshire and Humber to have a definition around what is parental conflict, what does a healthy relationship look like. We've developed toolkits, a website, self-help that you can go, parents can go on, anybody can go on that website and have a look, and it gives you some tools about how to communicate better, how to argue better. We all have arguments, you know, that's part of life sometimes. It's just about how we resolve them and what our children see when we do that. Lots of tools for families to go away. There's some really strong videos of children and their experiences on there, Maddie and Chloe, and what they see when parents argue. They're really powerful videos that I suggest you look at if you've got time. I think we are really pleased with we've got a relationship toolkit that we have for practitioners that we use, and also our colleagues in our dance service may use that, because actually where there might be a situational domestic abuse incident, actually could be parental conflict in this. These tools do cross over those boundaries. We have trained a lot of staff across the partnership in the last 3 years around healthy relationships. That includes all of our health visitors and school nurses and nursery nurses, our early years provision staff out there, childminders and nurseries, all internal early help staff, newly qualified social workers, Aspire Drug and Alcohol Services, our family group conference. We've still got more to do in terms of reaching out to our police colleagues to understand the difference, and some of our community staff about understanding the difference around a domestic incident. Is that parental conflict? And actually, could we support these families to get the support much earlier? And I'm really looking forward to taking that work forward, really. That's very quick in terms of the slides, an update. We've got some data on there as well that's taken from our domestic abuse hub, thinking about the referrals from an adult perspective into the domestic abuse hub where there are children in that household, and those are on the slides as well, and also some data from an early help point of view of how many have come through for parental conflict and how we've demonstrated that impact when we've worked with families in terms of reducing that parental conflict in the home.
Thank you. Look, whistle stop tour. I don't like to rush people, but you can see, you know, panel members have already read all this stuff, but I know we need to highlight things and get the message out there. So I'll just pass over again. Thanks.
So I'm just going to point out the figures that just give you a bit of a sense of what we get to our children's front door. So at our children's front door, we pretty much accept everything in terms of information shared. So sometimes we are getting some contacts that we would class as parental conflict, but what we do when we get that contact is advise that referrer back as to what we're doing with that information. And then what you'll see is the number that progress through. So we do know that domestic abuse is one of our significant indicators, and the reason that sometimes people do get in touch. And what you will notice is that we then progress and accept those as a referral. 91% of those move on to assessment, and that means that if we get that information and it gets to that stage, we're doing some work with all those people around that family and that child to know and understand what their lived experience looks like. And at that point, I'm going to move over to Helen, who is representing the Domestic Abuse Navigator service today. So if you wondered what DAN means, that's what it is. So I'll hand over to Helen.
Hi, good evening. I do apologise that Alicia, who's the manager of the dance service, was due to be here this evening, but unfortunately she's not very well after coming back from holiday. So I'll try and fill her boots, but I think it's a tall order. Just to talk a little bit about the Domestic Abuse Navigator service, we're a therapeutic whole family approach to working with families where domestic abuse has been identified. Our criteria is it has to be high risk domestic abuse incident within the last 6 months. There has to be some additional complexity, i.e. substance misuse, mental health, learning disability, and it has to have a statutory plan, so it has to be open at a child in need or child protection level for social care. We work whole family, which means we work both with the children, with the mothers, and also often with the person who's causing the harm. We take a therapeutic trauma-aware, trauma-informed approach to intervention, and it's really interesting that the importance of understanding the type of harm that is being. What type of domestic abuse are we talking about? That's the premise, that's our model of practice. We need to understand and get underneath to be able to develop an intervention, a therapeutic intervention to actually help and support that family in a different way. Is it coercive control? Is it situational violence? is alcohol involved, substances involved. So it's really important that we understand the nature of the domestic abuse and to develop an appropriate intervention plan. We work both psychoeducationally with both parents and we work directly with children and young people. Working whole family aims to break that patterns of re-representation and ensuring the victims and children are provided with support to recover from their experience, and allows knowledge that we hope will enable them to live a safer and much more fulfilling life moving forward. Children are supported to understand healthy relationships and recover from their experience and reduce the impact of domestic abuse. We have no expectations of parental separation. Sometimes that's part of the process, but very often what we find is parents want to be together, they want to be as a family, and we will work in a safe way through appropriate safety planning to ensure that the family can be worked with in a safe way for the children. In terms of numbers, there are 5 DANs. At any one time, we're working with approximately 35 families, approximately 80 children. In terms of input, we often work with families for approximately about 12 months. And in terms of re-referral rates, it's quite interesting in terms of our outcomes. We have incredibly low rates of re-referrals back into the DAN service nationally. When you look across the country, about there's a 20-25% re-referral rate into children's services. What we find, if DANs have been involved with the family, we're at 0.1%. So the work that we do, and it does take time, and the way that we manage it is very effective. Within the dance service, we also offer a number of different program approaches. We offer a caring dance program, which works with people who harm. We offer a caring getting on program, which is adolescent parent violence. One of the kinds being talked about quite a bit through this presentation, which is about working with primary school children. And our community engagement worker also does an awful lot of work linking local businesses and driving up everybody's understanding around domestic abuse. I think that's it. I think that's covered the slides for dance. Any questions?
Yeah, I think it leads on to, our first couple of questions, really. I'll just ask mine, and that was to ask, when these courses are offered to parents, is it mandatory? Or if it's not, what kind of uptake do you have? Do people willingly go on these courses and want to, to have a better life, basically, and for the children?
I can say that most often most courses are oversubscribed. I think we could double the offer, and we would have sufficient referrals to be able to fill places. So there is a need. They're very effective. Yeah.
But you're going to have some, you could call them perpetrators, but you're going to have some parents that are not willing to go on these courses. So you're saying they're not mandatory, but people want to do them?
They're not mandatory, and part of the acceptance, particularly on the caring dads, is perhaps the person's acknowledgement of the role they've played in the harm that they've caused, and the course will enable them to expand on that and learn much more around why they themselves behave in that way and the impact that that has on children. So they're not mandatory, it's an offer. But we do see a lot of success through that, and we do see a lot of uptake as well.
Yeah, just before I bring Rebecca back in, it's a bit of a generalisation, but I suppose it can spark something in them because, you know, it might be the case that they were in that situation as a child, and, you know, I'm no expert, but I do hear that it's like history repeating itself in many ways. They see that is what families are, and that's what they experienced as a young person. They can either, you know, acknowledge that and want their lives and be a different parent, or sometimes it just naturally, it kind of mirrors what they experienced as a child. I don't know if I'm right in thinking that.
Absolutely, and currently the dance service are involved in a further piece of research with the Nuffield and research in practice looking at intergenerational abuse and helping the dance service design a model about how perhaps we can work with that in a much more effective way moving forward. But certainly, you know, people's experience, their own trauma, recognising their own trauma as adults is a really powerful and important part of the therapeutic process.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work you do as well. Do you want to come in, Rebecca?
I just need to highlight by the time a child and family is involved with the dance service, it isn't just the dance service working with them, it's part of a children's social care offer.
Yeah.
So the courses may not be mandatory, but what we're being really clear with parents about is this is what we need to see change around. The programmes are one part of our offer around supporting them to be on that journey to change. So for parents that might not engage with that, they will be engaging with the social worker around some of the similar issues, which is why we're taking the training that's delivered on some of those courses to social workers so they can be the first responder. Sharing your life history, what you've done in front of a peer is very powerful in front of a group, but it's not right for everybody. So we recognise that, and some of the work can be done on a one-to-one basis as well. But by this point, we've got a really clear threshold about what we need to see change, because our children can't continue living with those life experiences. And actually, the adults shouldn't still be living with thinking that that's okay. So our real main aim of work by this point is how can we drive that change? And we're not going to step away until we're assured that that changes, that safety's increased. And that sometimes means making brave decisions too. So DANs are really pivotal in helping us understand safeguarding responses, what's good enough, what's safe enough, have we exhausted, can we try again, what should we do next? But there is also that bottom line of if families aren't willing to engage in the different types of work that we do, we need to reassess and say, can that child safely stay with those carers now in that situation? And we'll go through lots of different ways to make sure that they're safe. I think the point that you raised about trauma is really important. That's what dance service do really well. They work whole family, and that's quite innovative in a domestic abuse service. Often what you get is a community-based service doing work with the victims. You don't get a council-based service that's trying to wrap around a family and say, we're going to help all of you. I think it also reflects that some of our relationships that we experience aren't as clear as a victim and a perpetrator. Some of our families are quite caught up in difficult relationships where sometimes, a female might say, I'm not having this anymore, and I'm going to show some of the same behaviours that are shown to me, or they revert to alcohol use and substance misuse because of their experiences. So we try to work really closely with all those agencies and the staff to understand, exactly like you said, how can we help the family and the adults feel better in themselves, because that means that they want their children to have a better experience too. So just wanted to say, by the time DANs get involved, that's where we're sitting.
Thank you. And from this case studies, you can see what impact it does have on the people that go through that system. But I think Antoinette's got a question on the case studies.
Yeah, and they were really positive, and I was interested to read that actually one of the major things that came out was people felt that they weren't judged and that it was a positive experience, but that's from perspective, I suppose, of the victims. I'm thinking from what you've just said as well, it's almost 50% are re-referrals, and what work or what lessons have we learned from working with the perpetrators who are re-referrals and working with the family so that it isn't a continuing cycle. So bringing it back to children and young people, what is it that we're doing with them within these situations that really support them not to mirror the behaviours they've experienced and to become perpetrators themselves?
I think if you're thinking a bit about the re-referrals of children, what we always try and do is think about the help and harm continuum in children's social care. So where a family wants to engage with help, we will offer help where it is safe to do so. If we judge that, and that sounds awful, but it's what we do in children's social care, if we judge that the risk is too high, we will step into that safeguard space. That sometimes means that when it says a re-referral comes in, that might have been felt to be a lower level, but actually 3 low-level referrals might indicate you've got a pattern of behaviour which is not okay, and we need to respond differently when we've got that re-referral. What we also know sometimes is that professionals want to tell us everything, so that re-referral might not be in relation to domestic abuse. There's a massive amount of work in Doncaster about recognising serial perpetrators of domestic abuse. That is something we're on a journey to address, and I think the fact that we have a Caring Dads programme, and I think you do see there's some bits of feedback, isn't there, from a gentleman that accessed that Caring Dads about how life-changing that was for him and how he felt being able to stay with his partner and his child was really powerful. They're the bits we need to get out there, that it's okay, that we can change that narrative around moving from relationship to relationship. And I think probation, police and the Doncaster Safeguarding Partnership have done a massive amount of work about recognising how we can be really assertive and clear. Clare's law is often something as well that my social workers will encourage men and women to consider, that, you know, if they know that there's a history, we try and use all of the network of support to either stop the harm happening or help people make choices so that they protect themselves and their children.
It just is of concern there, because I've seen it in schools where, you know, families are subject to domestic abuse and violence within the family, and the children very often do mirror the kinds of behaviours that they're seeing at home, either with their own siblings or with children in school. So it's the work that you do to kind of support the victim to not move on to become a perpetrator, either immediately or later on in life.
And I think that comes back to the trauma work, isn't it? Around what we find is some of our adults that enter in similar relationships don't necessarily have a great level of self-esteem, and unfortunately some of our perpetrators are very good at picking that out. So what you will see is through a lot of the courses that are offered, it's about self-empowerment, it's about self-respect, and I think that rings through the Dan's examples. Case studies actually about people feeling empowered to make decisions that are different, to recognise patterns of behaviour, and I think that is the work we need to keep doing. But it's not just about doing it at our edge of the service, it's recognising how parental conflict can be quite toxic. It's about recognising how our partners and communities recognise and just not tolerate domestic abuse. I think that's the bit that needs to shift and change. But we're all in that space of trying to do that healthy relationship, create brave conversations.
It's just around, I think you might have answered this question, but around training for staff, particularly in schools, because they are dealing with the younger end victims, or as it moves through school, maybe turning into that perpetrator-victim scenario. So are there any schools where it's been done particularly well, or any programmes that are being used particularly well, and is that being shared across the piece?
Just to come in there, we've got a wonderful By Doncaster website. I don't know if you've been on there, and it offers all the training that Karen talked about, the reducing parental conflict training that's open to any professional law schools, and schools access those quite heavily. I haven't got the data, but I know that I can see when I go on, I can have a look at all the courses and see there's lots of schools accessing all of that training that is available.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully they do choose to take on that training. We did have a question around Marek, but I think you've already said that does start at 16, so that's useful to know. We'll go to Councillor Bluff for your question.
Thank you. So it's more geared towards to the men, obviously with dads. I mean, you mentioned with Dan that it's with the children, the mothers and the perpetrators. There's no mention of fathers there, because the perpetrator isn't necessarily the father. It could be mum's partner, it could be dad's partner, or it could be mum. What difficulties do men find when they're looking for help? Because the abuse to children could be going off while they're at work. It could be if mum and dad are separated, there could be a custody battle. Mum could be whispering things in the kids' ear. Dad could be whispering things in the kids' ear to turn the kids against the other parent. What sort of support goes on there? Because at the end of the day, the kids are then left as piggy in the middle between the two conflicting sides of it. And the abuse isn't always dad. We know sometimes it's not talked about as much as violence against women, but we do have a great number of men that suffer from domestic abuse in this country as well, unfortunately. It's just not something that's spoke about and publicised as often as the violence and abuse against women is, unfortunately.
I think if you look through the documentation, and I think if you look through the strategy, it is really clear that it isn't just women. The Phoenix Refuge is particularly set up, and it has a hub that particularly responds to men, for example. I think we also I try to move away from the word perpetrator because it's more trauma-informed. I can see Karen smiling, because it's very different in a world where it's police nominal perpetrator. So I think we recognise the complexity of relationship, and I don't think I try to use the word mother, I try to use the word parent in recognising that parent space, because you can't make assumptions. And I think there's an amazing documentary, if you don't see it, I think if you've seen it recently, the My Wife, My Abuser, that's really powerful. There's a lot more in the public narrative, isn't there, around recognising a man's lived experience and how it's a bigger barrier to talk about it because of that sense of masculinity, loss of control. I think a lot of our discussions very much recognise, particularly around coercive control as well, that it is something that is very fluid and it is about healthy respect. We try not to genderise it, but then I think there are points where we absolutely specifically talk about men and women experiencing domestic abuse. The amount of men accessing and reaching out for support, I think, seen an uplift over the past few years nationally and locally. But I do think it's something that we're very mindful of and hyper aware. But I can see Alison eager to press the button too.
Just coming in at that point as well, we are seeing in the early help space more referrals coming in around parental alienation, which is what you talked about obviously when one parent talks about the other parent in front of the child as well, particularly in the private proceedings. So we are doing a lot of work around parenting plans, accessing mediation through our mediation services in Doncaster, having families accessing the vouchers that are available for them to access mediation before they even get into a court arena as well. So trying to do that at the earliest point to prevent some of these things escalating into the domestic abuse space as well.
And it's I just want to say, I had no idea that Phoenix had anything on offer for men because it's always publicised as Phoenix Women's Refuge. So is that, I mean, I know it's slightly going off about away from the children aspect, but is that something that is widely publicised? Because I've never seen anything anywhere. I've seen posters up for Phoenix Centre, but I've never seen anything about the fact that they look after men suffering from domestic abuse as well.
Phoenix Women's Aid linking really closely with Men's Advice Line. So there's a national Men's Advice Line for men who are victims of domestic abuse. So they provide refuge space, as do we, for male victims as well. But that's one of the reasons they get quite a high number of male victims, because they link in with that national Men's Advice Line as well.
Can I just ask, is it right, am I right in thinking that there are separate entrances at Phoenix for men and women? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's single-sex spaces still, so there would be no mixed accommodation in terms of the safe accommodation that we provide.
Thank you. So now we've got a question from Councillor Needham.
Thank you, Chair. It's about COVID times, really. We speak about COVID quite a lot and how it has an impact. And I just wondered, have figures got better or worse from those times, and would they mirror what's expected?
Yeah, we did see a spike in referrals during COVID, but when we looked at the referrals that were coming through to us, it was really interesting, and obviously this links in very closely with what we're talking about around children and domestic abuse. So the referrals that we were getting in around the COVID time, obviously there's a lot of national publicity about domestic abuse, but we were seeing a lot of referrals into the domestic abuse hub around child contact and disagreements and conflict around who should be in what bubble or allowed out of a bubble, and disagreements around that. So some of it was domestic abuse, but some of it might have been more parental conflict and disagreements because of the situation. Things have steadied off a little bit now, and we have seen a reduction in reports coming through to the hub since COVID.
So, yeah, just wondering, although this might not be being done now, but maybe it's something to do in the future, it's about measuring like the successes of the people that have gone through. You were talking about children, young people. So if they've just experienced domestic abuse, how do they progress during their lives? You know, it's probably something to think about for the future, but I'm not sure if we're already doing this, but just to kind of like track how they're getting on. And because we've already touched on, you know, it can often be that they might repeat those behaviours that they've experienced growing up. So I just wondered, you know, what do we do in actually just tracking how they do get on, and are they you know, able to live happy lives really after having experienced. I know there's varying degrees of domestic abuse, but just wondering if you're factoring that in at all.
We factor it in terms of trying to speak to as many people who've been through our service and find out what their experience was and whether we've provided a good service, so kind of satisfaction, follow-ups and everything. But I think the main thing we do is through our survivor liaison service, so people who have been through other services or been through the council services, no longer in abusive relationships, then engage very often with our survivor liaison service. And then we get feedback and we get to see their journey, because there's no limit on the amount of time we work with the survivor. And a lot of people who have been through domestic abuse then want to work with us, because it can be quite cathartic with us, working with us, and finding that they then want to get into this area of work as well. So we do have lots of people with lived experience who we've supported in the past that come through to us. I do think we can get better at the voice of the child and understanding their experiences. And that's definitely something within the strategy in terms of what does success look like, how do we measure it, and getting that voice in.
Thanks. Just a quick follow-up really, because there are two aspects of it, aren't there? There's life chances and there's future happiness, and those do sometimes coincide, but not always. So I suppose there's some very easy data crunching that you could do in terms of life chances, because you can crunch the data in terms of GCSEs and career paths and so on. Perhaps the voice is more important to look at the future happiness of people who've been subject to domestic violence and abuse in the home. And I don't know if those figures are available, because you did talk about some figures that show that children that experience domestic abuse don't do as well in terms of life chances in other areas.
So there's a lot of research into children and life chances and outcomes, and also about repeating that cycle. There's as much evidence to say that children who have been victims of in households with domestic abuse have actually acknowledged that that's not acceptable and will not tolerate it in their own life, as there are those who have gone on to be victims or perpetrators as well. So for me, you know, it's got to have some impact, but I think it's about what support's available, what supportive networks are available, how we manage it. And even if we haven't done any specific intervention with a child or young person who's experienced domestic abuse, I think very often if we change the environment, so we work with the people causing the harm and with the victim of domestic abuse as well, change that environment, very often the children will thrive without any intervention. But I also do think we need that, some specialist intervention, which is why we do provide that in our refuges as well, because they're children who obviously not only experiencing domestic abuse, but they've had to be uprooted from their family, from that supportive network as well, and moved out of areas. So we do, as part of our commissioning, we do provide specialist support for children who are in refuge accommodation as well, which is vital.
Yeah, please do.
I just think we need to be really balanced in this area around tracking children's life chances after they've come to the attention of children's social care specifically. We don't end working with children until we think we've made the right difference in their life and that they are safer, and that includes being emotionally more resilient to move forward and not repeat patterns. I completely agree with Karen that I think sometimes we know about the children that go on to experience harm because they've experienced it because they're more present in our system. They're easier to track because they're coming to our attention again. I think our successes less come to our attention, but I know that in early help they use something called outcome stars. So if there's an intervention offered, they start at the beginning and they will measure that at the end, and the specific questions around, do you feel happier, do you feel safer? And we've got that tangibly from young people and from families. I think we've seen the difference that having an empowered parent that feels able to move forward does and makes a difference. But a parent is one part of that. It can also be a grandma, it can be an educator that stepped into that space. So there's lots of things that tackle those ACEs, which can influence a child, that isn't just one factor. I also think that in terms of moving forward, there's something a bit about not having them come back into our system and our services. So that is something that we also tangibly manage. But I think what we hold as adults and what we worry about is really hard to track for children in terms of success and to get a measured outcome on that day, because a lot of the families we work with, domestic abuse is not the only challenge that they are facing. So I just think we need to not just see domestic abuse and that correlation as directly linked. There are lots of people that don't experience abusive family life and go on to abuse. So you just need to be careful in that space. And please know that we try to gain every measure of success. And perhaps the biggest sense of success is they get on with their lives and they don't need to come back and see us in children's social care, which I'm always proud to say to families, in the nicest possible way, I hope not to see you again. And that's our biggest measure of success, that we've made a difference.
In a big picture way, that's probably really important, isn't it? Because as a society, there have been societal changes and we are talking about it more, and it isn't as hidden as it used to be. So that's a positive in itself, isn't it?
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to recommendations. And can I just ask the Children and Young People's Overview and Scrutiny Panel, do we note the content of this report? Yep. Noted. And I think as a recommendation, it would just be to, recommend that the work continues, especially the multi-agency work. I think there's a lot of good collaborations going on, and to, the work that the Youth Council do, and that must be recognised as well, as we've talked about, capturing the children and young people and their voice is so important. I think another recommendation might be one that Councillor Bluff mentioned when we were talking about possibly the council could write to the Doncaster cinemas, I think, and ask for them to consider featuring the film that we saw earlier on a goodwill basis, really, rather than at a charge, because, I think we need that domestic abuse awareness to be, like you said, if it's shown throughout October and it's just something that happens, and maybe future youth councillors will do, a bit of an update or a different film, but I think it needs to be continuous, because unfortunately I think it's always going to feature, and we're always going to be working hard to combat, and like you say, complex relationships. It is just ongoing. So I'd like to see that as a recommendation. I don't know if the panel agrees on those recommendations. Yeah, and I'd just like to say, this is the last meeting for this panel until after the elections, obviously, and I'd just like to say that there's a clear distance travelled in this panel, and I'd just like to thank all the panel members and the officers. I know some won't be here that have, given us their time in past meetings and everything, but I'd just like to say I've really enjoyed chairing this panel, and I think that I've certainly got a lot from it, and I think all the panel members will agree with me. I know some are not here, but I think, we're here for our children of Doncaster and the young people. So, yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody. And I'll just move on to the work plan, Christine, because you'll still be here and there'll still be a work plan. We don't know who else will be, but Christine will still be here. So.
Sorry. Thank you, Chair. It is, as the Chair's just said, we are at the end of the term this year. The work plan and the forward plan of key decisions is there just for your information. As usual, if there is anything that members wish to consider, if you just let myself or Caroline know. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll close the meeting. Thank you again. Thank you.